This is a production of World Video Bible School. To God be the glory.
You know, there are many people that come to Jesus. Matthew uses a specific word, and he's trying to develop a theme as far as people coming to Jesus. He uses a word, pros elthon in Greek, that means to come to. And beginning in chapter 8, we're going to have a number of people that come to Jesus. For example, the leper is going to come to Jesus. The centurion in chapter 5, or in chapter 8, verse 5, is going to come to Jesus. And then in chapter 8, verse 19, we're going to have a scribe that comes to Jesus. Then the disciples in chapter 8, verse 25, are going to come to Jesus. And we've got others that will come. Disciples of John the Baptist, the ruler of the synagogue in chapter 9, verse 18. The woman with the hemorrhaging in chapter 9 and verse 20, and so on through the gospel. We see lots of people that are coming to Jesus. And what it seems like that Matthew, through inspiration of the Holy Spirit, is doing here is he's trying to show that people come to Jesus for different reasons. Some come to Jesus because of selfish reasons. They're just wanting something for themselves, and they really don't care about spiritual things. Others are coming to Jesus out of sheer curiosity. Maybe it's because it's what the crowd is doing, and they're sort of following the crowd. And then there are others that come to Jesus for sincere, genuine reasons. They're wanting to learn of Jesus. They're wanting to be a disciple, potentially, of Jesus. And so they're wanting to come and learn more. That's a good question, then, for us. Why are we coming to Jesus? What are our reasons for coming to Him? Are we wanting something because of selfish reasons? Are we coming to Jesus because we are poor in spirit and we know that He can enrich us? Are we coming to Jesus because we are hungering and thirsting for righteousness and we know that He can satisfy us? Those are good, genuine reasons for us to come to Jesus. He is the Lord. We need to come to Him as Lord and serve Him. But as Matthew is presenting Jesus in the Gospels, and as we go through these presentations, and we're seeing in chapter 8 and 9 miracles. Remember what we have called chapters 8 and 9? We're calling them the miracle chapters because you have 5 miracles in each chapter. And in chapter 8, you have a variety of miracles over every conceivable aspect of the world, the external world, the internal world, the spirit world, the natural world. And then in chapter 9, they're going to be 5 miracles, but they're all going to be physical miracles. This shows us that Matthew, through the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, is being very structured in what he is trying to say. All right, notice verse 2. And behold, a leper came to him and bowed down to him, saying, Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. You know, in the parallel account of this particular event, in Luke chapter 5, verses 12 through 14, it says this man was full of leprosy. Dr. Luke tells us he was full of leprosy. Now that shows us just how extensive this man's leprosy was. Now leprosy is a very, very awful skin disease. And then as the leprosy reaches its advanced stages, the skin turns white and begins to flake off. Eventually, the person's skin becomes so thin that it is no longer able to hold the blood within the body as our skin does, and so sores start breaking open and the people can, in fact, bleed to death. A very, very awful, dreaded disease. Those in biblical times, Jews who had leprosy, were those that had to show themselves to be a leper. They had to cover their face and they had to go around and say, unclean, unclean. And the lepers were those that were put in leper colonies separated from the rest of people. And lepers were not used to people caring all that much about them. And so you can see the sadness in the leper and hear the sadness in his voice when he says, Lord, if you're willing, you can make me clean. He's perhaps saying if you're willing because people were probably not very willing to help a leper, to reach out to lepers and try to help them. And so the leper has no reason to suspect that Jesus would be any different than the rest of the people. If they're not willing, why should Jesus be willing? But he bowed down to him, showing his respect for Jesus, his acknowledging that Jesus is worthy of that respect and that worship. And so he says, if you're willing. And he stretched out his hand and touched him, saying, I am willing. How incredible is this particular event? He reached out and touched him. How long has it been since the leper has been touched? He went around trying to keep people from touching him, saying, unclean, unclean, so that no one would even brush up against him. And now we have Jesus touching him. If anyone had touched the leper, that would have made that person unclean. And the law of Moses talked about what you had to do to become clean. Also, there are certain kinds of leprosy that was very contagious, and it was possible for a person to contract the disease and become a leper themselves. So lepers were people who did not have the joy of human touch. To have Jesus reach out and touch him was a demonstration of the love and the compassion that he had never seen before. Well, did this make Jesus unclean then by touching the leper? The multitudes that would be watching this would be asking the question, why would this teacher be purposely touching a man and making himself unclean? Well, that which was holy that touches that which is unholy becomes unholy itself. But not so with Jesus. Jesus does not go through a long sermon to them, but he just simply says, I am willing, be cleansed. And he was cleansed. So in this case, that which was holy touches that which is unholy and makes him holy. This is proof of the authority of Jesus. What would a miracle like this be like? The recreating of the skin, that must have been a marvelous thing to see. We don't know how the cleansing occurred, but the word immediately is significant. As he writes, we need to be impressed with how when Jesus did something, it immediately came to pass. And Jesus said to him, see that you tell no one, but go show yourself to the priest and present the offering that Moses commanded for a testimony to them. Well, why did Jesus not want him to tell anyone? The text does not tell us, but here are some suggested reasons. First, he was not wanting people to follow him for the wrong reasons. Jesus did not want to create a large following where people were just looking for entertainment. Second, it might cause problems for the man himself. And Jesus is wanting to keep him from having even more rejection in his life. Remember the problems that were created for the blind man in John chapter 9 and verse 34 when he was kicked out of the synagogue as a result of his association with Jesus. Third, it would emphasize the miracle and not the teaching. Jesus doesn't want people to follow him just for the sake of the miracles themselves. He wants them to focus upon his teaching. Matthew chapter 12 verses 15 and following would further emphasize that. And then fourth, it would arouse Jewish opposition. In Matthew chapter 21 verse 15 we see a perfect example of where the miracles of Jesus aroused this opposition. And this also goes along with a point that's frequently made in the Gospel of John, and that is, my time is not yet come. Jesus was operating on a particular timetable, and others could have, through their promotion of Jesus, sped up this timetable, and Jesus wants to go at a certain pace. Now, we freely admit that those are all suggestions. The text does not, in this example, tell us why Jesus did not want him to tell anyone. All right, he's supposed to go and show himself to the priest. In Leviticus chapter 13 and 14, you see what the law required, and it was a fairly extensive process. He had to show himself to the priest. He had to wash his clothes. He had to bring a couple of birds, one of which was going to be sacrificed, another one of which was going to be set free. And then 7 days later, he comes back having washed his clothes. He shows himself to the priest. He's got a couple of sacrifices that he needs to offer. And then the priest is going to announce him to be clean. When it says, the last part of verse 5, for a testimony to them, we're not exactly certain what Jesus means by this. Is it a testimony to the people that they need to subscribe to the law of Moses? Or is it an indication to the Pharisees that Jesus is one that is still saying that you need to do what the law of Moses prescribes? We're not certain what he has in mind there. Verse 5, and when he had entered Capernaum, a centurion came to him entreating him. Now, you'll recall we talked about Capernaum earlier. Capernaum is a city today that has been excavated. It's a very beautiful city up in the north regions of Galilee on the very top part of the Sea of Galilee. And according to chapter 4, this was the place that Jesus made as his hometown. And as you can see, Capernaum is a very beautiful place. Well, there is a centurion that comes to Jesus, maybe knowing that this was his hometown, knew that he could find Jesus there. And a centurion was a Roman officer that ruled over 100 men. While this is a parallel account with Luke chapter 7, we might remind you that the account of the centurion in John, the 4th chapter, verses 46 and following, has some major differences. And so we don't think that that is a parallel account where the one in Luke 7 is. A centurion, of course, was not a Jew. And this being true, there is a lot to this man's credit. He's got to swallow a lot of pride to come to Jesus. He's a Roman. They would consider the Jew an inferior individual on the lower crust of society. And being a Roman would, to come to a Jew, that would be a tremendous humbling of himself. But he was willing to humble himself because he has a problem. In chapter 8, in verse 6, it said, Lord, my servant is lying paralyzed at home, suffering great pain. This, again, is the word kurios, Lord. This is a begging and entreating of Jesus. He's really humbling himself by coming to Jesus, and he's demonstrating an attribute that you would normally not expect to find in a Roman leader, and that is the compassion for others. But he's concerned about his servant. He has the kind of heart that is willing to swallow his pride and come to Jesus. And he's coming on behalf of his servant, one who's paralyzed and suffering greatly. Jesus said, I will come and heal him. Now, the fact that Jesus was willing to go into a Gentile house would have been shocking enough. Now, although there were no laws against such in the law of Moses, this was not something that was acceptable among the Jewish people for a Jew to enter into the house of a Gentile. But Jesus, breaking with the norm and the traditions of the time, was willing to go into the house of a Gentile. The centurion quickly says, Lord, I am not worthy for you to come under my roof, but just say so, and my servant will be healed. He does not want to presume upon Jesus and perhaps put Jesus in a situation that would have him offend his own Jewish countrymen. He doesn't want him to do that. Everything about this centurion is showing an attitude of meekness and humility, a very powerful man, but yet a very humble man. And he's demonstrating an incredible knowledge of Jesus, knowing that Jesus is one that has authority. Look at verse 9. For I, too, am a man under authority with soldiers under me. And I say to this one, go, and he goes, and another come, and he comes. And to my slave, do this, and he does it. Now when Jesus heard this, he marveled and said to those who were following, truly I say to you, I have not found such great faith with anyone in Israel. Out of the people that Jesus has encountered, of the Jewish people, there is no one that demonstrated the kind of faith that this Gentile centurion is demonstrating. He is one who is used because he has authority to say, you do this and you do that and you go here and you go there, that it's going to happen and it's going to get done. He recognizes that Jesus has that kind of authority as well. So he says, and I say to you that many shall come from the east and west and recline at the table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. All right, so there are those that are going to be a part of this great messianic banquet that we talked about earlier. This was something that all of the Jews were looking forward to, and the prophets of the Old Testament, as well as those that wrote in the intertestamental literature, talked about that people would come from great distances to be a part of this messianic banquet. However, they supposed that those that would have the chief seats of this messianic banquet would be those of Israel, those who had descended from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The idea of having some Gentile sitting with Abraham and Isaac on their right and left would not have been a concept the Jew would have agreed with. But nevertheless, they knew that there would be other people that would be a part of that. What Jesus says that would have been so shocking, though, is in verse 12. But the sons of the kingdom shall be cast out into the outer darkness. In that place there shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So as Jesus is addressing the multitude, he is saying that these people that are outside of the Israelite nation are going to come, and they're going to be welcome to sit at Abraham and Isaac's table. Well, the sons of the kingdom, those are the Jews. The ones who are supposed to inherit the kingdom are going to be kicked out. Now, we had mentioned earlier that every time you see the word kingdom, you cannot automatically say that it means the church. How about this as an example? Here we have, you're reclining at the table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. Were Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the church? No, of course they were not in the church. They were in the kingdom of God. They're in heaven. And so here is an example of where the word kingdom does not mean the church, but it's talking about the overall rule of God. That's where Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are, and that's where everyone who is faithful to God will be. Now we want to say again, though, that the kingdom on earth is the church. You cannot be in God's kingdom while on earth, while living, and not be in the church. It's simply not possible. God's kingdom, God's people, are those that are in His church. And we'll pursue that some more when we get to chapter 16. But nevertheless, we're just pointing out that the word kingdom does have some flexibility and meaning in the Gospel of Matthew. All right, he says that they're going to be cast out into outer darkness, and in that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Matthew uses the phrase outer darkness two other times, once in chapter 22, verse 13, and in chapter 25 and verse 30. Outer darkness would align itself with the concept of being outside the camp, outside of God's people, outside of salvation. And it is synonymous with the place of pain and suffering, as illustrated with the next phrase, there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Now, the weeping and gnashing of teeth is descriptive of what this darkness will be like. And when we look at this particular phrase, it is a recurring phrase in Matthew, occurring in these passages, as you can see on the screen. The weeping is because of the great pain. The gnashing of teeth is kind of the gritting of the teeth together in order to try to endure the pain as much as a person can endure it. But it's certainly not an attractive idea at all. And this is what Jesus is saying. He's saying outer darkness will be for those that are not illustrating and demonstrating the kind of faith. Just because you're a son of Abraham does not mean that you're going to recline at table with Abraham. Just because, as John said, do not suppose that because you're a child of Abraham that you're acceptable to God. God's able to raise up stones to children of Abraham, Jesus said in the Gospel of John. So the important aspect is not just saying, Lord, Lord, not just saying, well, I'm a descendant of someone, but doing the will of the Father. All right, verse 14. And when Jesus had come to Peter's home, he saw his mother-in-law lying sick in bed with a fever. And he touched her hand, and the fever left her, and she arose and waited on him. Now, there are a number of miracles that Jesus does, for example, with the centurion servant, where he doesn't touch anybody. He's able to heal over time and distance. But there are also miracles where Jesus chooses to touch, like with the leper, and now with Peter's mother-in-law. And the fever is something that's an internal thing. You can touch the skin and know that the person has a fever, but it's something that's from within. How did Jesus have the power to heal that which was internal? What is happening to a person that causes them to have a fever? Well, by the touch of Jesus' hand, the fever left her. Notice that she arose and she waited on him. Many times when someone suffers from a fever, they're still left weak after the fever leaves them. Well, not so with Peter's mother-in-law. She was one that once the fever left, she was able to get up and resume her normal duties. Now, we also need to point out that it says that it was Peter's mother-in-law. There are those that say that it is not acceptable to marry, and who try to say that the apostles were not married. And some in religious circles say that those that are priests are not allowed to marry. Peter was one, obviously from this text and in 1 Corinthians chapter 9 and verse 5, that Peter was in fact married. Well, so we can see that marriage is something that's acceptable, and even Paul in 1 Timothy condemns those who try to forbid marriage for anyone. It's a part of God's plan. Verse 16, and when evening had come, they brought to him many who were demon-possessed, and he cast out the spirits with the word, and healed all who were ill. All right, now what did we say that this was called? This is called a miracle section or a healing section. And there are 8 total in the Gospel of Matthew, and we're going to have one here in chapter 8, and then we're going to have another in chapter 9, where Jesus heals them all. Now this fulfills an Old Testament passage. This passage is found again in the book of Isaiah, chapter 53 and verse 4, that said, he took our infirmities and carried away our diseases. This is a perfect illustration of what Matthew is trying to accomplish. Jesus is one that fulfills, that wraps up, that completes in the fullest possible way what these Old Testament passages are saying. We expected the Messiah to be one who healed. Isaiah 53 and verse 4 is illustrating that. Now look at what Jesus is doing. He is healing the masses. He is healing all who were ill. Do you know that the gospel records do not record one single failure on the part of Jesus? Everyone that came to him was healed. Verse 18, now when Jesus saw a crowd around him, he gave orders to depart to the other side. So because of the attention he's getting and all of these people that are following, he wants to go to a different area. Now, for the first time, Matthew is going to talk about what it means to be a follower. Jesus goes to the other side. People are going to be following him to the other side of the Sea of Galilee we're talking about. And a guy comes, a certain scribe, and says to him, "Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go." There's our key word, follow. This man was of some value to the Jewish, was an important man in the Jewish society and saw some value to following Jesus. We might be impressed with this scribe's willingness to follow. He says wherever he goes. Yet it's clear from Jesus' response that the scribe has a different concept of what it means to follow Jesus. Are we prepared to follow wherever he goes? Jesus responds and says to him in verse 20, "The foxes have holes and the birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head." Now what we see from this is to be a follower of Jesus, you have to do 2 things. First of all, you have to count the cost of being a follower. He says, "I'll follow you wherever you go." Jesus says, "Have you really thought about this? The foxes and the birds have it better than I have it. I don't even have a place to lay my head." Was this scribe thinking about the luxury, the wealth, the attention that he would get by being a disciple of Jesus? Jesus says you've got to count the cost. Second, the person has to prioritize. You cannot be a follower of Jesus and have a number of other things that are very important in a person's life so that they take a priority over Jesus. Matthew chapter 6 and verse 33 says, "Seek first the kingdom of heaven and His righteousness." Did you notice in that passage that Jesus does not say what you should have second, third, and fourth, and fifth? He doesn't need to. Because if you're prioritizing, if you're seeking first the kingdom, then God knows that whatever you put second and so on will be appropriate. And so as this individual comes, and then the other individual in verses 21 and 22 comes, they need to count the costs. Are you willing to pay the price of being a follower of Jesus? I have known people, as a result of their following Jesus, who have lost family. Their family has disassociated themselves from them and say, I don't want to have anything to do with you. I've known people that when they became Christians, they could no longer continue in their occupations because their occupations were not noble and honorable occupations. They were not earning their income in an honorable or legal or scriptural way. Well, as a result, they counted the cost. There was a tremendous price to pay. And then Jesus says you've got to prioritize. If you're going to follow me, you've got to really decide to follow. Remember when Jesus said, no man putting his hand to the plow and looking back is worthy of me or is fit for the kingdom of God? That's the kind of mentality that Jesus is talking about. I have to be first. If you're going to call Him Lord, that means master, ruler, controller. If Jesus is Lord, then He has to be the one that determines the direction that our lives go and what's most important to us. He has to determine how we're going to spend our time, who we're going to spend our time with, how we're going to worship, how we're going to conduct ourselves in the business place, how we're going to conduct ourselves in the home and in the neighborhood and with people that we meet. Jesus is the one who guides our life, every aspect of our lives. That's prioritizing. It's putting His will first. All right, let's look at this second example then in verse 21. And another of the disciples said to Him, Lord, permit me first to go and bury my father. But Jesus said to him, follow me and allow the dead to bury their own dead. Well, this disciple has to prioritize. He's going to have to seek first the kingdom of heaven. Now, there are some that think that Jesus was being uncharacteristically harsh and unkind here, because here is a man whose beloved father has died, and he wants to just go bury him, and then he'll come and follow Jesus. Well, we know that in biblical times that they buried individuals on the same day that they died. For example, when Lazarus died in the Gospel of John, he was buried on the same day, and then Jesus comes along several days later. So this man does not have a father that has died in all probability, but he is a sick man. He is an ailing father, and he wants to tend to him until his father dies, and he anticipates his father to be dying sometime in the future, and then come and follow Jesus. Well, certainly we have known of people, and maybe even some of our own family, who became sick, and the doctors did not think that they were going to be well for very long, when in fact they did hang on for a considerable period of time before they did in fact die. Let's suppose that this man's father, although he was very sick and was not expected to live for very long, lived for another 3.5 years. What would have happened? He would have completely missed the entire ministry of Jesus if that would have been the case. There's an application. There's so many applications to us today. We have to focus on living righteously during the week. We've got to do what Jesus wants. If we're going to follow, we have to count the cost. We have to prioritize. There is a price to pay to be a disciple of Jesus. There are some things that we have to get out of the way so that Jesus can be first in our lives. All right, it says in verse 23, when he got into the boat, his disciples followed him. Notice the concept of following. The disciples are going to stick with Jesus. Wherever he goes, that's what they're going to do. And behold, there arose a great storm in the sea, so that the boat was covered with the waves, but he himself was asleep. Apparently, the ministry of Jesus was such that it just wore him out. And we're seeing the humanity of Jesus here, in that even though he's the Son of God, this great storm was such that it wore him out, wiped him out, so that even though the boat is rocking and the storm is carrying on, he is one who is fast asleep. Verse 25, and they came to him and they woke him, saying, Lord, they said, save us, Lord, we're perishing. Now we know that at least 4 of the disciples were fishermen. They know what to do in storms, but they don't know what to do in this one. They are of the belief that they're going to perish in this storm. It's just that bad. They know enough about storms to know that they're in big trouble with this one. They've tried to steer the boat back to shore, and they're not able to do it. So they say, we are perishing. While they are thinking about being saved physically, there's another question that Matthew wants us to ask. If Jesus can save someone physically, does he have the power to save one spiritually? If one comes to Jesus in the storms of life, with the trials and hardships, Jesus can save. And he said to them, why are you timid, you men of little faith? He then arose and he rebuked the winds and the sea, and it became perfectly calm. The Sea of Galilee, which you'll recall is up in the northern part of Palestine, is in fact a very beautiful sea. It's one that's 21 kilometers long, which would be about 13 miles, and it's 13 kilometers wide at its widest point, which would be about 8 miles. And so you can imagine that they could be as far as 4 miles from land, and being that far into the shore, it would be very difficult. Jesus comes, he says that they're timid, they're men of little faith. He arose, he rebuked the winds and the sea, and it says it became perfectly calm. You can imagine by looking at that picture just how calm the Sea of Galilee is, and that's the kind of calm that was made by Jesus, the one who created the seas in the first place. Now there's something else that happens in the Gospel of Matthew that we want to be aware of, and that is the use of the interrogative, or the question. Questions that are being asked in Matthew are very, very important. Let's pay attention as we go through the Gospel of Matthew to every question that's being asked. Now, here is a question in verse 27. The men marveled and said, what kind of man is this, that even the winds and the sea obey him? All right, there's a good question. What kind of man is Jesus that has this kind of power to get the winds and sea to just do what he says? Well, it's important to remember that he's with the disciples. They cannot deny that something happened that these experienced fishermen have never seen happen before. They've never seen a storm just instantly become calm. That's not the way weather works, especially on the Sea of Galilee. So what kind of man is this? Now, does the Gospel of Matthew answer the question? No. It does not answer the question, because we are to also ask the question and then in our own minds come up with an answer to that question. So as we look at the Gospel of Matthew up to this point, what kind of man is this that's able to calm the seas, that's able to control the wind? Well, there's obviously something very special about this man. All right, now let's go on to verse 28. And when he had come to the other side of the country of the Gadarenes, 2 men who were demon-possessed met him as they were coming out of the tombs. They were so exceedingly violent that no one could pass by on that road. All right, this brings us to the 5th and final miracle of this chapter. And if we look at the parallel in Mark chapter 5, this is one of the examples of what is called the synoptic problem. Because in this account, we have 2 men, and in Mark's account, we have just 1 man. But the answer here is more easily solved than some would like to admit. In Mark, one of the 2 is the predominant one. He is the one that's receiving the majority of the attention, whereas Matthew is kind of backing up and he's given a more general view where there are in fact 2 that were demon-possessed. And so this is not a contradiction accounts. It's just that Mark wants to focus on the predominant of the two men that were demon-possessed, and Matthew is just quickly given an overview. All right, and behold, they cried out, saying, "What do we have to do with you, Son of God? Have you come here to torment us before the time?" Now, once again, we notice that we've got some questions. We have two very important questions, and let's consider these questions and then briefly discuss the answers to them, even though the text in Matthew does not answer. What do we have to do with you, Son of God? They recognize, because they're part of the spiritual world, that the evil spiritual world, that they have nothing to do with the spiritual world where God and His faithful angels reside. They have nothing to do with Jesus. They're of the demonic realm, not the good spiritual realm. Now, this is going to help us in chapter 12 when Jesus is charged with casting out demons by the power of Beelzebub. Beelzebub is not going to work against himself. He's going to do that which is going to help his cause. Well, what do those who are of demons have to do with the pure and holy Son of God? Well, they have nothing to do with Jesus, and they know that. And then they ask a second very important question, and that is, have you come to torment us before the time? What time are they talking about, and how do they know that Jesus is going to torment? And how did they know that He had the power to torment? By recognizing Jesus, they know that He has authority, and they know that He is the one that they're going to have to answer to in the day of judgment. The demons also know that they're going to suffer. But nevertheless, they recognize that maybe this isn't the time. These demons are hopelessly corrupt. You know, the Hebrew writer points out in Hebrews chapter 2 and verse 16 that Jesus does not give help to angels, but He does give help to the descendants of Abraham. Well, so these demons are without hope. They are not going to be helped. Well, these have witnessed the power of Jesus. These are individuals that know that Jesus is going to torment them. And they also know that there is a time that God has designated in which that torment is going to begin. We know that time to be the day of judgment. It's going to be that day or that time. It says, "Now there was at a distance from them a herd of swine feeding, and the demons began to entreat Him, saying, 'If you are going to cast us out, send us into the herd of swine.'" All right, so they said, this is again a first-class conditional, not meaning if, but since you're going to cast us out. They knew that Jesus was going to cast them out. They said, "Send us into the herd of swine." So Jesus says, "Begone." They came out, they went into the swine, and then the whole herd rushed down the steep bank into the sea and perished in the waters. And the herdsmen ran away and went to the city and reported everything, including the incident of the demoniacs. You know, every gospel writer is careful to point out that these swine perished in the waters. Now, although this is not confirmed in any passage in the Scriptures, there was some thinking of some in biblical times, and perhaps these people believed that the only way that a demon could be destroyed was by water. And I don't know whether that's true or not, but all of the gospel writers that record this point out that they perished in the waters. All right, that concludes then our study of chapter 8, and we'll begin our next class with chapter 9, verse 1.